Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Excellence in Governance Day ceremonies. My name is Michelle Garoot, and I am president of Ensuring Tomorrow. Before I turn the activities over to Zach Charrington, let me briefly introduce you to our special guest to the right of me. To the far right of me is James C. Kirkpatrick, who we honor today. To the left of him is President of Central Missouri State University, Dr. Ed Elliott. To the left of him is Supreme Court Justice for the Missouri State is Ann Covington, and to the left of her is your President of Student Government Association, Zach Charrington. Ladies and gentlemen, Zach Charrington.
Once again, welcome to the Excellence in Governance Day activities. I'd like to give you, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this event, a brief history of the event. The Excellence in Governance program was established in honor of Mr. James C. Kirkpatrick. He's a distinguished Central alumni and former Secretary of State for Missouri. He retired from that position in 1985 after 20 years of service. In 1985, Student Government Association started the Excellence in Governance program to recognize people who had served government well, promoted good public policies, promote the public interest. Past recipients of this award include Mr. Kirkpatrick himself, John Ashcroft, Avis Tucker, Ike Skelton, and John Danforth. And this evening, we'd like to recognize Chief Justice of the Missouri Supreme Court, Ann Kettering Covington, by giving her the award. Judge Covington earned her law degree from the University of Missouri in 1977. From 1977 to 1979, Judge Covington served as Assistant Attorney General of the state of Missouri, and then she went into private law practice in Columbia. Judge Covington was appointed a judge in the Missouri Supreme Court of Appeals Western District in September of 1987. In December of 1988, she was appointed to the Missouri Supreme Court. Judge Covington is the first woman in Missouri to serve in each of these capacities. On behalf of Central Missouri State University, Judge Covington, I present you with this year's James C. Kirkpatrick Excellence in Governance Award.
Thank you, Zach. I think that my role here tonight is not to speak. In fact, I first said I wouldn't, but I wanted at least to say thank you and how honored I am to be a part of this award of excellence. I know that it comes from the students, which means quite a lot to me, that the students made the nomination and that the Student Senate made the final selection. Particularly, I'm honored because of the name, person, and for whose great service to the state of Missouri, Jim Kirkpatrick. I have no person whom I admire anymore. I have an opportunity to visit with Rebecca Cook, the present Secretary of State, from time to time, who, among almost all of other Missouri citizens, values his counsel today. It is indeed an honor. It is also an honor for me to be here at this campus. I had a wonderful, delightful visit with your president, who has brought Central to, in a sense, I know, stardom in the university system in the state of Missouri. So for all these things, I am grateful. I commend you, and I thank you.
Tony Snow is a nationally syndicated columnist for the Detroit News and a counterpoint columnist for USA Today. His editorials appear in various mediums around the world. He is a commentator on National Public Radio and as a permanent guest host for Rush Limbaugh's radio program. He recently replaced Bill Bennett as a political analyst on Good Morning America and as a regular contributor to such television programs as the McLaughlin Group, the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, Face the Nation, and Crossfire. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to introduce to you Tony Snow.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to extend my congratulations to Justice Covington, and it's a pleasure to, we just had the honor of having dinner with the honorees and everybody. It's really been terrific. I also want to thank you for inviting me here on such a nice spring day. As you know, the topic of conversation of this particular event is to talk about excellence in government. Unfortunately, I'm going to talk tonight about Washington. Now, what I'd like to do is to give you a brief summary of things that have been going on in the nation's capital in the last few months. And I think probably the best way to capture the spirit of what's going on in Washington is to give you a parable of two brothers. The brothers' names are Newt and Bill. Now, the fascinating thing about the two brothers, Newt and Bill, is that these are two guys who could have been separated at birth. They have an enormous amount in common. For instance, these are two people who believe absolutely that the world of politics outshines all other occupations on the face of the earth. They are wildly ambitious. They are men who also perceive themselves as something of, well, academics, eggheads, people, men of ideas. But a funny thing has happened because at this point in our history, Newt and Bill find themselves on the national stage, indeed on the world stage, slugging it out to figure out which man is going to have the right to be remembered in the history books as the person who shaped the destiny of the United States going into the 21st century. Now, I'm going to talk about them in turn, and I'm going to start off with Bill. Bill Clinton, in many ways, is our first accidental president. Now, I say that because I was in the Bush campaign in 1992. I worked in George Bush's White House. I did not write the Dana Carvey lines. But we ran the dumbest, stinkiest, funniest, most awful, god-awful, actually, presidential campaign in modern American history. And Bill Clinton, despite it all, almost managed to lose. Nevertheless, when Clinton came to office in 1992, he was accompanied by an incredible reservoir of goodwill. Think back to 1992 for a minute. Think back to his inaugural address as president. I was working, I get out of the Bush White House, the first thing I do is run to radio, and that's right, I did something for NPR. And we all thought at the time that it was wonderful because Clinton brought to the office a palpable sense of idealism. If you recall, he was somebody who had the energy and the youth of Kennedy, and yet he promised the American people that he was going to be a new kind of Democrat. By that he meant somebody who was going to make government lean, efficient, it wasn't going to cost as much, it was going to lower taxes, but at the same time, this very same government was going to appeal to all of our natural sense and yearning to reach out, to help the poor, to deal with the homeless, to bridge the gap that divides races in this country, and to develop an America that is as good as the aspirations and ideals of the American people. So, although people had some reservations about William Jefferson Clinton, at the same time, they said to themselves, we want to give this guy a chance. We've had failed presidencies. And people forget the last 2 years of the Reagan presidency were pretty awful. The Bush presidency, with the exception of the Gulf War, was basically a failure. And so folks were ready to see a president succeed and restore to the office of the presidency some of the glory that they felt had been imparted to it during the early Reagan years. 2 years later, just 2 years later, Bill Clinton led the Democratic Party to the most dramatic defeat in modern political history. Let me just recapitulate what happened. In all the United States House of Representatives races, no Republicans lost. No Republican incumbents lost. 52 Republicans beat incumbent Democrats, or won Democratic seats. In the U.S. Senate, no incumbent Republican lost. Republicans picked up a number of seats that keeps changing because people keep switching parties. You have 31 Republican governors for the first time in my recollection. In the last 25 years, we have not had a majority of governors who are Republicans. And in more than 5,000 state legislative races around the country, 5,000. Guess how many Republican incumbents lost? Any guesses? 11. 11. That's just amazing. That is the definition of a wipeout, ladies and gentlemen. Things have gotten so bad that the only new Democrats these days are becoming new Republicans. And every day you see a little more hemorrhaging. We've had one senator switch parties. We've had 3 members of the House switch parties. And there are rumors of a great deal more. Now, what happened? What happened to transform Bill Clinton from an idol of the masses into basically a president that the Democrats hate to love? What happened to Clinton? Well, one thing I think really summarizes it all. Bill Clinton has become the modern master of the self-inflicted wound. And let me give you a couple of examples. First, there's political. In the very first major, and I'm not talking about little minor stuff like the gays in the military, his very first major political decision of this new Democrat was to seize control of 1/7 of the nation's economy in the form of the health care system. And furthermore, this being a co-presidency and all, he decided that he would hand the worst job in American politics off to his wife. Now, I'm a married man. I know that if I were to do something like that to my wife, I would spend the rest of my life sleeping on the couch. Come to think of it. Now, there's a second. There are political self-inflicted wounds as well, or actually practical. When I think of the Clinton White House, I think of the old poem, The Children's Hour. And I'll tell you why. There was a lot of talk when Clinton was elected about how wonderful, youthful, vibrant, idealistic this White House staff was. But now it is merely seen as young. The most important office, arguably, in the White House is the Office of Communications. This is the place where the president makes contact with the American people. It's where he does his speeches, are handled by the communications office. Any contact with the Washington, D.C. press, with the regional press, papers in Kansas City or St. Louis, with radio stations, television stations, with national politicians, local politicians, interest groups, student groups, you name it, it is handled by the Department of Communications. And in the first year of the Clinton administration, the median age of the people who worked for this vital office in the White House, the median age was 23 years old. Now, I want you to think about it this way. What would you feel about handing the most important, most significant office in all of democracy, the precious crown jewel of people's hopes and aspirations, not only in the United States but around the globe? How would you like to handle responsibility for that precious office over to your roommate? Because that's precisely what happened. The Clinton administration came in and basically took a bunch of kids who had just come out of college, no offense intended, and handed it over to people who had no experience in the real world. It is rumored that Richard Riley, who is the education secretary, has promulgated something known as the Riley Rule. And the Riley Rule goes like this. When somebody from the White House calls with a request for a point of information, with a demand for action from the president, with any kind of message, it doesn't matter. Anybody calls from the White House to the Department of Education, the person on the other end of the line at the Education Department has been requested to ask first and foremost, how old are you? And I think to follow it up by saying, does your mother know you're doing this? There has, in the White House, it's sort of governed by kind of anything goes situation. There's an ethic there of, well, we'll get over it tomorrow, we'll talk our way out of trouble. And as a result, the president has created for himself a series of problems that are inexcusable, often because they're just plain stupid. Prime example. The president has nominated Dr. Henry Foster to be Surgeon General. Now, I do not want to get into the specifics of Dr. Foster's life, but let's just talk a little bit about the political wisdom of trying to replace Jocelyn Elders, the controversial Jocelyn Elders, with somebody who, as a profession, is an obstetrician and gynecologist. That is a person who, of necessity, will somehow come in contact with the most intractable, emotional, ugly, muddled political issue in America today, and that is abortion. Somebody in Washington put it best. Why didn't they just choose a foot doctor from Denver? And yet we're going to have a long, protracted, ugly squabble over Foster's nomination, and for what? Ask yourself for a minute, what does a Surgeon General do? Does anybody know what a Surgeon General does? Any guesses? I'll tell you what a Surgeon General does. Since the days of C. Everett Koop, they've done 3 things. They talk about condoms and cigarettes, and they have these uniforms that they've stolen from the Love Boat. And the notion of somehow inviting an ugly, bruising political fight over such an inconsequential position is just crazy. The other thing is, this is an administration that has deliberately refused to give proper scrutiny to people appointed to positions of high trust and responsibility. Example, Mike Espy, Agriculture Secretary, former Agriculture Secretary, is now being investigated by an independent counsel. Ron Brown, the Commerce Secretary, is almost sure to be investigated by an independent counsel. Henry Cisneros, who is the HUD Secretary, is being investigated by an independent counsel. And by the way, this is a fascinating one because Cisneros knows, everybody knows, that he lied to the FBI about paying off his mistress. Now, in the old days, there was a sense of honor that prevailed in Washington, and somebody would have said, "I'm sorry, I've embarrassed you, Mr. President, I'm going to leave." But instead, Cisneros decides to fight it out, and the president says it's okay to lie to the FBI. This guy could run for Senate in Virginia. That's about the same sort of thing that Oliver North did. And now you have also Federico Pena, who's the Transportation Secretary, who is still under suspicion of a number of things. All of which brings me to the central point. The issue in 1996 for Democrats is probably not going to be whether Bill Clinton will get 4 more years. It's going to be whether his entire cabinet's going to get 5 to 10. Clinton also made a key mistake. One of my rules in Washington life, it's actually a key rule of survival. If you want to survive in Washington, you have to understand this one principal cardinal fact of life, which is that in Washington, you cannot take friendship personally. You know, when I was in the White House, the first year I was there, I got 450 business cards. Bush was at 90% or something. These were mostly from people I didn't know. The following year, I got 15. You know who your friends are. Well, what happened to Clinton is he came to Washington and he thought, everybody loves me. Look at all this adoration. They love me. No, they loved the power. And 2 years later, when Bill Clinton became a political liability to Democrats, what happened? He would fly into a town and the Democratic candidate would fly out. Now, we had this sort of thing happen in the Bush administration, but it became really pronounced in the Clinton years. In fact, it was so bad in '92 that it is rumored that a few Democratic candidates who didn't get out of time fast enough and were stuck on the podium with the president later asked to enroll in the FBI Witness Protection Program. Democrats have become pretty cranky about Bill Clinton, and I think it's unfair, and this is a serious point. The president happened to be the Democratic office holder at a time when it became obvious to everyone, something that had been dawning on the national conscience for some time, which was that the Great Society wasn't working, that the great liberal experiment, which successfully governed the United States for 62 years between 1932 and 1994, had finally run out of steam. Bill Clinton became the scapegoat for the failure of an entire theory of government. That was unfair. Nevertheless, he's the person who paid the price, and one of the reasons why is that he had heightened expectations so much when he was running for president. It's true that everybody who runs for president tries to portray themselves as somebody who really can do everything, and Clinton overdid it a little bit. If you recall, all the campaign commercials and the personal biographies and so on would talk at one moment about this humble little guy from Hope, Arkansas. You know, you can see a long stem of grass sticking out of his teeth, barefooted, dipping his toe in the muddy waters. And later he would also talk of himself as a man whose higher instincts had been ennobled at such institutions as Oxford, Yale, and Georgetown. So when he came to the American people, it was not as somebody who was one of us, but instead it was a man of extraordinary proportion and contradictory backgrounds. That is, he came to the American people as Huckleberry Gandhi. And when people began to see the cognitive dissonance there, he began to fail the second and critical test of any presidency, which is the Leno-Letterman test. Jay Leno and David Letterman have told more jokes about Bill Clinton in 2 years than they told in 4 years about George Bush and Dan Quayle combined. Dan Quayle. Now think about it. This is a president who's been exposed to unprecedented ridicule by the comics. And one of the things we watched in the White House is how George Bush was doing. That is always a fair and accurate barometer of how people are thinking. And the way people are thinking is, Bill Clinton may be a nice guy, but we're not sure we can trust him. He's kind of laughable. We know he's putting it on. He strikes us a little bit like a student council president rather than a president of the United States. He's over polite. He says exactly what we want to hear. He's always gesturing, where is the real man? 2 years into this administration, I defy anybody in this audience to tell me who the real Bill Clinton is. It's impossible to find. And now we are entering the most perilous year of Bill Clinton's political life. As I said, the public doesn't trust him. There's a high level of skepticism. In fact, probably the most extraordinary thing that has happened in the whole debate about the contract with America is that Newt Gingrich and the Republicans pushed Bill Clinton off the front pages and put him on the nation's milk cartons. The president has vanished. I have been studying the front pages for the last month, and I swear to you that no more than 3 times a week has the President of the United States been making appearances. It's the most amazing thing I have seen. Scandal will be one of the key stories this year. Because the president not only has been thrown onto the defensive by a Republican Congress, basically he can no longer propose changes. The only thing he can do is say, well, I'll meet you halfway, and hope that his veto will enable him to sustain the threat. Instead, everybody thinks about the dreaded word whitewater. Now, I can tell you that the scandals in the administration involving cabinet members is going to be damaging enough. Again, I have no inside information about what's going to happen with whitewater. But here's how the process works. Independent counsel Ken Starr will start handing down indictments in just about a month. Those indictments will travel up to Washington. Congressional committees will begin hearing each and every one of the factual charges contained in those indictments. And slowly but surely, they will cover with mud all the people around the president. I don't think it'll get directly to the president. I would be surprised if it did. Bill Clinton is a smart politician. He knows to keep himself at arm's length from anything like that. And I'm not trying to impugn him. I'm just saying smart politicians know to keep away from trouble. But when everybody around the president finds themselves in difficulty or under a legal cloud, it cannot help but rub off on the president a little bit. And that's going to be damaging for Bill Clinton. But enough about the president. Let me talk a little bit about Newt Gingrich, the second person in our parable. Newt Gingrich, is viewed by most of the American public as an extraordinary character. Here is somebody who, through sheer gumption, courage, craziness, audacity, energy, and vision, has been the Moses for the GOP. He has brought the Republicans to a promised land that just 2 years ago seemed out of their reach. But the other thing that happens when people see Newt Gingrich is that it occurs to them that this is a man who has never had an unspoken thought. In fact, Gingrich, the fascinating thing about Newt is he will say anything on his mind, and he does. He can go from absolutely breathtaking spells of inspirational oratory to complete galling, stupid things. Let me give you an example. When he first became House Speaker, he delivered a wonderful little oration on the American dream. He said that it was time for America to reunite. We wanted a government that listened to the people, that cared about the people. He talked about racial harmony, which still remains the great embarrassing blot on the American experiment and the American dream. He talked about an economy that would be propelled not by a government program, but by the imagination, idealism, dream, and grit of the American people. Something that said to the American people, we are great, let's go for it. It was a wonderful speech. It got rave reviews even in places like the Washington Post. 3 days later, he's down in Georgia delivering an address to one of his college groups. And at that speech, if you recall, Newt Gingrich gave us the reason why we should not have women in combat. Do you remember what that was? Yeast infections. For a minute I thought he was running for Surgeon General. And yet Gingrich is a guy who has a certain lack of discipline when it comes to talking about the issues that affect the nation. And so you look at the poll ratings, it's not surprising. People think that Gingrich is powerful, they think he's ambitious, they think he's an egomaniac. So far we're 3 for 3. But they also look upon Newt as somebody who's a little bit of a loose cannon, and that is true. One of the things that surprises me a lot, though, about Gingrich, and I've known him for a long time. I've known Gingrich longer than I've known any other member of the House. We go way back. He didn't ask me, but his agent asked me to write his book. And wisely I said no. Who needs $2 million? But Gingrich, as a history professor, repeated all the mistakes that Bill Clinton committed when he first became president. Example, Bill Clinton becomes president, brings in the chiefs of staff, the entire, the chiefs of staff for the military, and humiliates them by announcing in their presence that he's going to put gays in the military, even though he said he was going to sort of chat with them first. Big political mistake. What's the first thing Gingrich does? He announces that in July he's going to put before Congress a school prayer amendment. Now, as soon as he did that, Ralph Reed, the head of the Christian Coalition, got on the phone and said, "Newt, please shut up. Not even we care about that. Do something important. Worry about spending and taxes. We'll handle the prayer." My favorite line on prayer was one that given years ago by Charlie Rose, a Democrat from North Carolina. He said, "As long as there are math tests, there will always be prayer in schools." And I think that pretty much summarizes it. Second big mistake. Gingrich, when President Clinton announced his Mexican bailout plan, Gingrich throws his arms around and says, "It sounds good to me. It's like Clinton running ahead of Democrats on health care." And immediately he discovers that 2/3 of his own caucus is opposed to him on this. They don't want him to do it. But Gingrich soldiers on anyway. The third thing is, when Clinton first became president, a lot of his 20-something communication staff decided that they were going to have something called Bill TV. You remember this? Every time you turned on TV, you were supposed to see Bill Clinton. Every time you turned on the radio, you were supposed to hear Bill Clinton. And the problem for these folks was that they got their wish. So we ended up seeing Bill Clinton, talking about boxers or briefs. We saw him playing the saxophone. We saw him in those cheesy running shorts. Well, the same thing's happening with Gingrich. Every day they televise the speaker's press conference. And so you get to hear whatever Newt has to say about anything. And the fact is, people do have a certain limit to listening to anybody. And what they did with Gingrich is, they turn in the channel. You cannot be overexposed in American politics, and especially as a president, but also now as what amounts to a domestic policy president, in the case of Gingrich, you have to keep something special about those appearances. Don't show up all the time. Have a little mystery. Make people want to see you. Don't make them gag whenever they see your face on the TV. Now, at this point in the fight between Bill and Newt, Newt clearly has the upper hand. And he has it for a couple of reasons. Number one, as I've said before, the Democrats have basically run out of steam. The grand coalition that was held together for years by the ability of Congress to pay for promises to different constituencies, that's all fallen apart. You can't buy a party anymore. And there is no overarching philosophy that holds Democrats together the way it did in the old days. I mean, the ideal of a welfare state was a coherent philosophy. Now discredited, there's nothing to hold the party together. Republicans at least have a marching plan. You see, I look at the Contract with America. I do not see anything that's radical. The Contract with America is basically incremental little policy stuff that everybody agrees with. It was all stuck in there because 70% or more of the American public liked it. It was a no-brainer. We've been through a period of vigorous incrementalism on the part of Congress. Now we are looking at the real challenge for Republicans because, you see, in 1994, Republicans did not win a mandate. What they won was an audition. Let's face it, folks, when they think about Republicans, don't think about big-hearted men and women of the people. They look at a party, and it's Caucasians are us. They look at a party that looks to them to be amenable to rich folks and absolutely afraid of dealing with the poor. Republicans have a big PR problem. And they're going to have to fight it in two ways. Number one is with policies. And the real fun in politics in Washington is going to start happening next month. John Kasich, the Budget Committee Chairman in the House, is going to have to propose a budget that comes into balance by the year 2002. That is going to mean real live budget cuts for the first time in our history, our recent history anyway. And it's going to mean a brutal debate about priorities in Washington. The second thing is you're going to have a debate about an idea that everybody loves, and that's the flat tax. I love it too. The flat tax will be at the top of many people's agenda for 1996. In fact, if you look at the Contract with America, it really breaks down into three different areas, and this is the same for Republicans in their future. Number one is trust issues. Can you trust these guys? And to a certain extent, they bought a reservoir of goodwill because the House did what it said it was going to do. Notice they were cagey enough to say they weren't going to pass term limits, they'd just vote on it. Well, my guess is you'll see term limits voted on and passed sometime soon. The second kind of issues are economic issues. People really do care about their economic future. And the most powerful of these issues, as I just said, is the flat tax. Most people agree with Mark Twain. Mark Twain once said, "The difference between a taxidermist and the taxman is simple. The taxidermist leaves the skin." We have a federal tax code that runs in excess of 1,600 pages, whose regulations just explaining those laws runs in excess of 6,000 pages. The IRS every year prints out, get this, every year the IRS, sending out taxes, prints out $8 billion pages worth of forms and explanations. The American people waste roughly $385 billion just filling out the stupid forms. We got a crazy system. How many of you in this room who fill out taxes would love to see a flat tax that could fit on a postcard? Any takers? All right, yeah. Or Bill Archer, who's chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, wants to get rid of the IRS. Huh? You've got a revolution against the way things have been done because the system is just plain crazy. There's a third series of issues, cultural issues. And I think of two of them in particular. The first is legal reform. Now, everybody has a favorite lawyer joke, and I'm going to tell you mine. What do a lawyer and a sperm cell have in common? They both have a 1 in a billion chance of becoming a human being. You see, ladies and gentlemen, we have a legal system, and I'm sorry about that, justices. We have a legal system that these days encourages people to file a lawsuit when a kid throws a baseball through a window, rather than simply settling things amicably as neighbors. We have a kind of forced incivility. And I'm not saying that lawyers have precipitated this, but we have a system that's simply gotten out of control. You've got to put a lid on it. Legal reform is one of those things. A second and more profound cultural issue, one that just absolutely scares both political parties, is affirmative action. I won't go into great detail about it, but here's the fundamental question. How can you get rid of quotas without sending a message that you don't care? How do you eliminate special preferences while at the same time reaching out to the poor and the dispossessed? How do you restore a sense of American community without resorting to brutal numbers? I don't know. But it's the kind of debate that really helps define what we are as a nation. If we can conduct a civilized debate on this most passionate and divisive of issues, we're going to be a lot better off. And the challenge for Republicans really is to start building a big tent, a tent that covers all of the American public in the sense that people will look at Republicans and say, hey, I want to join that party. The GOP hasn't done that yet. The biggest party in the United States remains none of the above. You know, people to ask, pollsters say, are you Democrat, are you Republican, none of the above? None of the above tends to win in about 1 out of every 2 polls. So people are deeply skeptical of both political parties. What do you need to do to turn that around? In fact, what do you need to do in this country to revive a sense that politics is a good and noble profession? And here's where I'm going to get to the excellence in government part. The irony is, to have better government, you have to have less. Our government does too much. It does things that it has no business doing. I don't try to tune my car because I can't do it. You know, everybody has things they can't do. And the problem is the government is doing everything it can't do. It's taking good money and wasting it on crazy ideas. The fundamental idea behind the Republican contract with America and Gingrich's big ideas is very simple. The idea is that the people are good, the people are smart, that the presumption behind the welfare state, which is we're stupid and we need to be tended for, is not only wrong, but it's demoralizing. And it is time to revive a sense of American community and confidence, not by creating community and self-esteem programs, but by saying to Americans, it is time that we together shape the future, not merely by spending our tax money, but with our blood, sweat, toil, and tears, to steal a Churchill phrase. That's the kind of vision of America that gives us all a stake in what's going on. That's the kind of vision of America that says to each of us, it is time to pitch in. If you look at presidents who have been able to inspire over the decades, they're not people who said, pay your money. They're not guys who said, I have a great program. They're not even people like Bill Clinton who says, here's what I want to do for you. John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Notice what the emphasis is on. It's not on government, it's on you. Ronald Reagan talked of a shining city on the hill. Beautifully empty phrase. but it's one of those phrases that you can fill up with your own meaning. It relies on your imagination, not on his memory for detail. We have lost the ability in American politics to inspire. You've got an age of wonkery, in which Bill Clinton is telling you all the details of his programs, and sometimes Newt Gingrich is telling you all the details of his. And as a consequence, all you have is this sort of flurry of fine print, and there's no vision there. There's no idea of where we're going to go in the future as a country. If you want to restore excellence in government, give it a goal and give the people a real part to play. Now, we are living in the greatest, most exciting and thrilling political epic I think any of us will ever experience, because everything in Washington is up for grabs. Both political parties are still struggling and straining to identify their souls, to find out what their priorities are going to be in the future. Both political parties are looking for direction around the country. All the interesting experiments in social policy are taking place not in Washington, D.C., but in towns, in villages, in counties, in cities, and in state capitals all around the United States. Thomas Jefferson once talked about the states as being little laboratories of democracy, and that's precisely what's happening today. With this wonderful intellectual ferment all around the country, Washington is looking for ideas. It's looking for guidance. And as we enter this period of great uncertainty and change, I want to get back to my two brothers, Newt and Bill, because we're going to have a period of time in the next couple of months that is funny, that is challenging, and basically where you got to expect the unexpected. Let me tell you a story that illustrates my point. Newt and Bill are driving around one day, and suddenly they get blindsided by a pickup truck. Bam! They die. You go up to heaven, you say, St. Peter, please, 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 please. We're young, we're visionary, we've got really long speeches we want to give. Please give us another chance. And St. Peter says, look, guys, I can't do it. I mean, I can't send you back, but I'll tell you what, I'm overbooked right now, so I will let each of you pick what you want to be. 6 months later, we'll collect you. Bill says, that is great. I want to be a stud. Wish is granted. Newt says, I would like to be an eagle. Okay, 6 months later, Gabriel is sent out to collect the two brothers. Newt's real easy to find. There he is, sort of floating above the Grand Canyon, talking about Alvin Toffler. But Bill is more difficult to locate because he is in a snow tire in Wisconsin. We have entered an age of great uncertainty and unparalleled promise. And this is a time that ought to rekindle everybody's ambitions to be a good and full partner in creating a better future. So my parting message to you is, as you look out upon this age, study hard, think hard, and take full advantage of this responsibility, because for one time in our lifetimes, we really have a chance to play a direct role in shaping our future. So go and make the most of it. Thanks. Now I'll take questions. I love these stage props. This is great. I do. Oh, come on. Somebody's got to have a question.
I never heard of a job approval rating before. Hi.
Aye.
I never heard of a job approval rating before for a Speaker of the House before Newt Gingrich. Is this part of a media attack?
Well, let me put it this way. Most people haven't heard of a speaker before. I mean, it really is. You know, there's some people say, well, there was Tip O'Neill, and there's some little guy before that. So I think, you know, yeah, Jim. I mean, think about it. Can you go back 4 speakers? And that's really the key. Newt Gingrich is famous basically for knocking Jim Wright out as a speaker and Tip O'Neill, and challenging Tom Foley, and then becoming speaker himself. I don't think it's part of an unfair media attack. I think it is an acknowledgement that over the past 20 years or so, really since the Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974, when Congress took away the line item veto from Nixon, the president has basically been a witness in the domestic policy process. And over the years, Congress became more and more and more assertive. And therefore, the president had less real authority over what actually happened in domestic policy. I can tell you that we were just bystanders in the Bush administration. Bush would propose something, and you remember the phrase. The Democrats would say, it's dead on arrival. Forget it, President. You have no power. So Clinton inherited a weakened presidency in domestic policy and suddenly rubs up against Gingrich, who was really the most assertive speaker we've had in a long time. Jim Wright was assertive and had a lot of direction, but he only had 5 legislative priorities for 1988. Gingrich comes up with 10, and he does them in 93 days. The amazing thing to me is that everybody seems to have accepted uncritically the fact that Newt Gingrich has usurped the president's power. He's basically, remember when Al Haig said, I'm in charge here? When people laughed, Gingrich is in charge. Bill Clinton has vanished from the equation when it comes to domestic policy. So I think it's an acknowledgement. Also, Gingrich makes a big tempting target. As I said, he says a lot of goofy stuff. He tends to be a little prickly under fire. He's got thin skin. And you know, when reporters see somebody being thin-skinned, they can't help it. It's like sort of jabbing one of those voodoo dolls. You know, you do it and watch. See how you can make him dance. Dance, white man. So I think, Gingrich is enormous entertainment value, but it's easy to underestimate it because he really does know where he wants to go. He's known from the moment he walked into Congress. And, you know, when you hear Gingrich talking right now, he's leaving a lot of things fuzzy, but you can hear flat tax. They're going to do things on affirmative action. They're going to take on some health care stuff, probably by privatizing systems rather than federalizing them. So, you know, Gingrich has already stunned a lot of Democrats because everybody expected, in fact, the Democratic philosophy coming into the beginning of this year, once again put together by the geniuses in the Clinton administration, was let Gingrich fail. Well, he didn't do it. You know, that was exactly like our philosophy in the 1992 campaign. I just wait for Clinton to stumble. Well, along comes election day, and Clinton didn't stumble. You can't let somebody else define the terms of the debate, especially when you're president. You've got the bully pulpit. You've got the ability to do things, and yet Clinton surrendered it, and he can't get it back. So you get public approval ratings for a speaker because a speaker is functioning as the president. He's proposing and he's passing. It's unparalleled in our history. George Will had a wonderful line. He said the last time we had a president this inconsequential was Calvin Coolidge, and he was inconsequential by design.
How would you propose the GOP take over a PR machine and get some PR going for them?
Actually, I think the GOP's done all right on its PR so far. Congress right now, you get a whole lot of different polling questions about Congress. The most important one, in fact, the most important polling questions you ever see are right track, wrong track. You head in the right direction or the wrong direction. And a poll taken last week, I forget which one, had a 53% right track for Congress. Let me just tell you how extraordinary that is. Before the last election, it was at 14%. Congress has its highest ratings this century. So, you know, people look at Gingrich. See, it's really smart. Gingrich is a lightning rod. Everybody says, oh, evil, terrible guy. Love his policies, though. Why is he such a creep? But, man, what great policies. So, you know, the Republicans are really feasting right now. And think about the issues where they've lost. On term limits. You know how many Republicans, let's start with the balanced budget amendment. There are I keep losing count here, but I think there are now 305 Republicans in Congress. 3 of them voted against the balanced budget amendment. That's 99% for. You had about 85%, if memory serves correctly, voting for term limits. So those are 2 issues right there that you could say separate Democrats from Republicans. Republicans are going to be out there pushing for a flat tax. Now, I just defy anybody, and I'm sure the Democrats are going to try to do this, to go out and say the flat tax is horrible. Your tax system should not be comprehensible. You know, we should have real campaign finance reform. There's no surer campaign finance reform than a flat tax. Because, like, all these lobbyists in Washington, what do? They spend their days trying to get special preferences written into the tax code. You have a flat tax with no exemptions, these poor guys are out of business. So the Republicans, I think, are actually doing okay. Look, the other thing is there's still a number of reporters these days who look upon the GOP leadership as kind of a temporary phenomenon. I guarantee you, I give you an absolute guarantee, if Republicans stay in power for another 6 years, that's 8 years, and then it's figured that it'll last longer and longer, you will start hearing Democrats complain, with justice, about a conservative bias in the media. Let's face it, reporters go where the sources are. For 62 years, who needed to know a Republican? These are sort of quaint little guys who sat on the back bench bitching about the deficit. But they didn't really play a role. They weren't real people. And now suddenly they're in power. If they stay in power, if you're going to get a story, you're going to have to be nice to a Republican. You can't just scorch them every day in the press. The press, for all its protestations of absolute independence, always has to be on reasonable terms with people who pay their checks, at least the publisher, not the advertisers necessarily, and also the people who give them their stories, and that's politicians. So I'm a little more sanguine about it. Got a mic over here? Whoop, sorry, go ahead.
Who do you believe was the best president in the past? And also, what will the next president have to do or be to be successful?
The best president, I mean, how far back do you want to go?
As far as you want to.
Oh, geez. Well, I mean,
you can give me a time limit.
I'm a big
and say
Lincoln fan, but that's cheap and easy. Let's go post World War II. I'll pick two great presidents in really sort of the World War II and beyond. Roosevelt was a great president. Roosevelt was somebody who absolutely betrayed all his campaign promises in 1932. But if you go back and listen to Roosevelt's speeches, Republicans are using all this Roosevelt rhetoric because it's precisely what they're saying today. Roosevelt did not say in the Great Depression, please send us money and we'll take care of you. What he said was, we will help you take care of yourselves. All the alphabet agencies, the WPA and everything, said to people, you've got to build bridges and roads. Let's build homes. Let's rebuild America literally. You've got a stake in it. It's your country. And it's that sense of personal involvement in creating a better future that made Roosevelt so profoundly beloved by so many Americans. There's a generation of Americans who still swear by FDR. There's nobody who does that about George Bush. You know, there was something there that FDR provided hope and eloquence and determination and boldness. I mean, if you look at what FDR did, it was just outrageous. It's crazy. It's amazing. He absolutely broke precedent. Every big move he made shattered precedent. It changed the way we thought about America, but it was successful. So he was a great president. And I think Reagan was a great president. But I'm going to qualify that. I mean, FDR was great in his early terms. Reagan had a great year and a half, and then he coasted. Big mistake. To be an effective president, you always have to be pushing the limits of the future. Reagan had a wonderful vision of the future. He pushed it through. You had a very fruitful first year with tax cuts, deregulation, a real lift in Americans' mood and spirits. Americans felt confident in themselves and their presidency. But then after that sort of petered out. He ran this no-brainer campaign in 1984. It was the Morning in America campaign. They had this really absurd ad that had a couple of bulls tromping through a field, and nobody knew what it meant. So, you know, Reagan basically ran on nothing in '84, and that's basically what people expected of him. That's why I insist to this day that's why Republicans lost in '86, and Reagan was crippled by Iran-Contra and the Bork nomination and everything in '87. But still, they were great presidents because they did bold things. And Clinton, to his credit, tried to do something bold. It was just the wrong bold thing. It was a stupid bold thing. We have probably run through our limit of great presidents for the century. You only get 2 or 3. And, you know, I think in 1996, it's probably going to be sufficient that one of the 2 people is an adult. And so I think that's kind of the, I mean, there's going to be an age of diminished expectations for the presidency and increased expectations for Congress, which gets back to our Newt Gingrich question. Polls for Speaker of the House and for members. So at any rate, now, advice for people running in 1996. Boy, is this gratuitous. I worked for Bush. Well, what the hell? I think, you know, you got to grab people's imaginations. I think the flat tax is a wonderful idea. I think the idea of taking, you know, picking out 3 or 4 cabinet departments and leveling them is a great idea. And I think also the idea of going out and being a cheerleader for the American people, saying, you're great, let's do things. To make Americans think of this as a nation that did house raisings when somebody moved into a neighborhood, Well, they weren't neighborhoods then, but you get the idea. A nation where people really do care about each other. They make contact with each other. The greatest sin of the welfare state is that it dehumanized compassion. It put compassion in the care of caseworkers rather than people who are just doing good deeds for one another. That's a bad thing. So I think to rehumanize all the things that make us special as a country, that is the challenge for a president. And you can mainly do that by A, cutting out programs, but B, following up with a message of compassion and caring. And use your bully pulpit to go out and inspire people and to focus a big bright light on good things. I think it's going to be important to be assertive in foreign policy, to have an economic policy that will restore the value of the dollar and confidence in the dollar around the globe, to have defenses that are secure, which means you're going to have some ability to deal with some crackpot who has a missile that he can slap a nuke on. Star Wars, as much as people may laugh at it, makes sense. And most of the people who have negotiated arms control agreements, Democrats and Republicans agree. So I think it's a number of those things. Again, boldness, boldness, boldness. But boldness not just for the sake of shocking people, boldness in something that gives people a real stake. The biggest problem with health care reform with Clinton is we're all observers. We are paying for something we couldn't see at the end. We all know what we mean by a better future for ourselves. If somebody says, I'm going to make that possible for you, chances are we're going to like it. You're a lot more successful at wooing somebody by telling them how beautiful they are than by giving a long dissertation on their warts. And what Clinton has done basically is said, we're an awful country, we're on the verge of all these terrible things, and you need my help. No, I don't. So those are the kinds of advice I would give to a president. I got to say, Dole and Gingrich in the last week have given two of the best speeches I've heard from Republicans in ages. Gingrich's speech Friday night was not bad. And Dole's speech was just wonderful. I don't know who's doing Dole's stuff, but he's got somebody new doing it. The speech he did yesterday announcing his candidacy was just wonderful. At the very beginning, had some line like, I grew up, my parents taught me to respect God above government and not to confuse one for the other. That's a nice way of saying, there are all these moral pretensions about liberalism. So that was a terrific speech, and I heard a couple of little sound bites of one he did today that sounded just as wonderful and lyrical and visionary. So anyway, that's a sort of long-winded way of giving my advice to those guys. So if you guys are watching on TV right now,
You talk about excelling in life and excelling in government. So how do you feel about the cuts and reforms to the student loan programs, which are pretty much our lifeline?
Well, see, that's what I disagree. I've gotten a lot of questions about that. Number one, I don't know what's going to happen with student loans. So, protestation of ignorance. But they're not your lifeline. You know what your lifeline is? It's your brain. And the other thing that's your lifeline is knowing that everybody in America understands that education is the key to the future. The federal government cuts loan programs. They're not going to shut down the colleges. People are going to find ways to finance these things. I mean, I really am one of those believers in people's innate goodness and also their survival skills. The loan program itself, like a lot of government programs, fill out the form, say the right things, you get your loan. If you don't get it. It dehumanizes things. I still see, we've got a real renaissance in American education anyway. It's being fueled by the information revolution, by the explosion of different alternative ways of going to college. Many adults are going to college right now without special help, but because they want to make their lives better. So I don't see student loans as the lifeline. Having said that, I also know there's nobody in Washington who's going to have the guts to cut them off or the foolhardiness. There's still going to be student loans. They're just going to be at a slightly lower level. So, those of you who have loans, be of good cheer. The key thing is, your brains and everything in life is not getting a loan. What it really is making your own way. And if you don't get the loan, you got to work. I mean, I had some loans in graduate school. I worked. You do what it takes. And once you've earned it, it means a lot more to you. So, I don't know. I'm cold-hearted on this, I guess. Well, I'll let the guy with the mic figure out. Actually, let's right here because he's been very patient.
Thanks, Tony. Members of the administration, represented by people like Dick Gephardt, Leon Panetta, have been dealing in misrepresentations, euphemism, lies. How would you recommend that the Republicans deal with those lies? Well,
it's a great question because one of the interesting debates in the next year is going to be over facts. So in the last couple of months, for instance, Gephardt saying The Republicans want to cut down on school lunches, and you know when they're doing the Democratic response to Gingrich, think about this. The Democratic response to a Speaker of the House? What they did is they ratified Newt's standing as the domestic policy president. But at any rate, there they are, sitting in front of these little Lilliputian school chairs with the alphabet in the background, just to remind them. It was this sort of cheesy symbolism. But the fact is, you know what they're doing with the school lunch program? Here's what they're doing. They're block granting the money back to the states. They're adding 4.5% additional every year over the presently appropriated levels. And they're saying to schools, spend the money on where you need it. If you already have enough money for food, spend it on textbooks. If you don't have enough money for food, spend it on food. The big problem for Democrats is next September, families are going to send their kids to schools, and they're going to find out they're not starving. They're not eating ketchup. You know, they're not being forced to eat swill out of little bowls. There's this sort of inflation of fear rhetoric. The Democrats have become a Chicken Little party. And over time, I mean, I can just see a lot of Republican ads next year, or in 96, well, that is next year, making fun of all these dire predictions. They said your kids would starve. Ain't happening. They said the elderly would be hurt. You know what we did? We cut the taxes on Social Security. They got more of their money. Isn't that awful? The big problem for Democrats is that they associate something that's being controlled in Washington with virtue. And if it's taken away from Washington, it's not virtuous anymore. Let me tell you something. The welfare system right now, 2 out of every $3 that goes into the welfare system doesn't go to the poor. It goes to the people who are the caseworkers. It goes to the bureaucrats. That's not a very compassionate system. I'm more than happy to send that back to Missouri and say, I bet you can do a better job. And that's really what's going on. You've got a lot of control freaks in Congress who think that they're the only ones who know how to do it. Know how to do what? So I don't have a lot of faith in the competence of Congress to do these things. They don't know what local problems are. And the school lunch thing is really one of the key wonderful examples of it because, again, there have been all these dire predictions and nothing bad's going to happen. Now let me say, on the other hand, a little counterexample. Republicans have this wonderful faith in federalism. Everything you send back to the states is going to be better. I guarantee you, some states are going to screw up welfare reform. It's just going to be awful. Some states are going to do a magnificent job. And so there are a passel of Pulitzers lying out there for people who are going to uncover these things. And Democrats are going to be able to score some brownie points. The problem is you cannot possibly do worse than our present system. And for every failure you're going to have a lot more extraordinary successes at the state and local level. We're in a period of transition between an old way of looking at things and a new way of looking at things. And the new way really hasn't taken complete shape yet. And the people who are the high priests of the old way are not going to take defeat gracefully. So they're going to say the sky is falling, the world's going to come to an end. They're mean, they're vicious, they lack compassion. Those awful, mendacious, baby-strangling creeps lack compassion. They don't say nice things about people. So, I mean, there's this sort of, again, this edge of hysteria and hypocrisy that are going to undercut it. I don't worry too much because people are going to look at the facts and consult their experience and say, these guys are, somebody's inhaling. Forever.
I was wondering if Congress was going to look into some of the more government-intrusive education reform acts, such as H.R. 6 and Goals 2000 and the School to Work bill.
Yeah, actually, there's going to be a lot of... it's funny. One of the things Republicans are responsible for is this awful idea that the federal government ought to set the goals for education. This is something we basically got rolling in the Bush administration under now presidential contender Lamar Alexander. Yeah, I think, if Republicans are going to be consistent about this, they got to stop telling people how to do things. And that's going to be one of the challenges. People care about education. They know what's going on in education. They care about their kids' futures, and they're sick of people in Washington telling them how to do it. So I think you will see a rebellion against that. I don't have any idea what kind of shape it's going to take. But it's amazing. Every year brings 1 or 2 big letter-writing campaigns about education, and in time they produce results. One of the things that's happening with a lot of power going back to the states is that when the federal government tries to attach stupid mandates, states are going to resist, even if they're Republican stupid mandates. A stupid mandate's a stupid mandate.
You mentioned in the contract with America that there are 3 issues that they deal with, one being legal issues or legal reform. the United States is a very litigious society right now. What do they propose to do to try to reduce that?
Well, there are a couple of things, and I mean, what you have right now is a bill that makes it much more difficult to file class action lawsuits on securities claims, which means basically, if a stock price falls today, somebody can always gin up a lawsuit saying, well, the owners here screwed the shareholders, and therefore they can sue a company out of business. That's one of the things you get rid of. Number two, they're going to put a cap on liability awards, pain and suffering, and so on. In federal cases, they can't do it with state and local cases. They can only control what happens in the federal courts. And the third is they're going to apply the loser pays principle, which is extraordinarily controversial, and the president says he will veto. The loser pays rule says if you sue somebody and you lose, you pay the cost. And the basic instinct is to get rid of nuisance lawsuits. There's a fascinating debate, I'm not going to get into the particulars, about other ways of doing that. The real key is take the profit out of it. Take the profit out of stupid lawsuits. And you don't do that by going after poor people who are victimized by things. What you really do is try to go after some of the more predatory law practices that enable lawyers to scrape up huge fees and the supposed beneficiaries of those lawsuits walking away with peanuts. So contingency fee reform is sort of the wave of the future, but Republicans aren't there yet. There are a number of interesting Republican scholars who are pushing for it, and I look for that to happen, somewhere down the road.
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
Coming this summer, the pundits have been telling us that we're going to have a big game of chicken between Clinton and Congress, and that the debt ceiling is going to have to be raised in order that the federal government doesn't go bankrupt. And they're saying that Gingrich and Dole may get together to tack legislation onto a bill to do this in order to get Clinton to sign that legislation. 3 questions. 1, what do you think of the politics of this? 2, what do you think is going to happen? And 3, do you think it'd really be that bad if the federal government collapsed?
Okay, well, let's go in reverse order. If the federal, yeah, sure, some parts. But it's really funny. The strategy for the federal government is always the same it is with local governments. When a local government is threatened with running out of money, what do they shut down first? Easy, the police and the schools. They take the most vital services, and that's normally what happens. We've had a couple of cases where the federal government has run out of money for a day or two at the expiration of the debt ceiling, and they always close down a couple of things. Or if it's July, close down Yellowstone for a couple of days and watch people go bonkers. Let's see. The second question is, what do I think about sort of the brinksmanship involved in the use of the debt ceiling is basically holding the debt ceiling bill hostage. I'm not a big fan of that. I mean, Republicans griped a lot when Democrats stuck stupid riders on things, and I think it's the same way. I don't think you should extort your way toward important victories. If you want to get the balanced budget amendment through, don't do it with the debt ceiling. Do it on the balanced budget, on its own virtues. When people see that sort of stuff, they recoil in a little bit of shock and horror. And the Americans know more about government now than they've ever known before. You see it on C-SPAN, you see it on CNN, there are online services, all you internet geeks who tune into Thomas to talk with Newt. There's all this stuff out there. So politicians can't hide like they used to be able to do. People know what's going on. They get angry. Rush Limbaugh goes crazy, and when he goes on vacation, I go crazy. So there are plenty of things, there are plenty of avenues for that. And what was the first question? What do I do? What do I think is going to happen? I think actually they'll probably cut a deal beforehand simply because that strategy hands a freebie to Clinton. Clinton can say, ladies and gentlemen, the Republicans are giving me this choice. What they want to do is they want to attach some bills that your own representatives didn't pass, that this free elected democracy wouldn't pass, and they want to hold everything hostage. They want to hold Social Security hostage. They want to hold the children hostage. They want to hold everybody who's young and vulnerable hostage just for their own seedy, conniving schemes. Well, that is a public relations winner for Clinton. So the smartest thing to do is to cut a deal on the side. And Clinton is somebody who doesn't really make the most of those opportunities. I think he wants to avoid a fight as well. So a completely gratuitous guess, and I'm probably wrong on this, but I think that they settle it beforehand, that both sides blink.
There seems to be a big concern nowadays over moral issues such as abortion, Norplant, prayer in schools, you name it. Do you think, with groups such as like the Christian Coalition and whatnot, do you think this is just a fad, or do you think this is actually going to have a large impact on the way we see government nowadays?
Well, morality has always been at the heart of American politics. When Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America about 160 years ago, he was always remarking, I mean, one of the lines that every president uses, and I can't find it in Democracy in America, maybe somebody made it up and attributed it to Tocqueville, but it's consistent with the spirit. It was, America is great because America is good. So we've always been concerned with moral issues. I mean, think about all the debates about slavery. I mean, slavery occupied the attention, imagination, and anxieties of Americans throughout the first 6 full decades of our existence as a nation. So morality is nothing new in this country. And morality as a key player in American politics is nothing new. The Christian Coalition wants to be a player in politics, which means that the last thing they can afford to be is considered a marginal fringe crazy group. So you will see Ralph Reed and company trying to pick fights they can win. And I think on abortion what you will see is a little bit backing off of saying we will not support anybody who doesn't believe in us, and a realization that abortion has been settled by the Supreme Court as a matter of law, and if you want to change it, you have to build political consensus over a period of years. It's a very complicated process because you must not only deal with the unborn, you must deal with the young mothers. Barney Frank once had a line, it's a quip that pro-lifers have to figure out a way to overcome, which is a pro-lifer believes that life begins at conception and ends at birth. It's a brutal sort of slam, and it's the sort of thing that people have to attend to. How do you deal with young children? How do you deal with pregnant mothers? Do you simply wag your fingers at them for sinning and having sex before they're married, and then wag your fingers if they're going to have an abortion? So it's an enormously complicated political problem, and there's no profit in hinging your future and your credibility on something that's not going to be solved at the ballot box in 1996. So furthermore, listen to Democratic rhetoric. Again, the liberal welfare state is just steeped in moralism, just absolutely steeped. If you listen to the rhetoric of the Clintons and of their Democratic forebears, it's always, we're doing what's right, and people who are opposed to us are evil, they're rich, they're greedy. I mean, the decade of greed, which is the all-purpose slogan for Reagan, is a profoundly moral slur. So it appeals to morality. So I don't have any problems with politics and morality being mixed up. What I do have problems with is people regarding the White House or Congress as places where you settle religious issues. That's how they do it in Iran. We don't want preachers in Congress. We don't want people handing down the one true faith. What we want is to have a free and open and reasonable debate about things we care about. And I think people with moral views have a right to it. We've demonized religion long enough, and it's time to let those people have a full place at the table in the political debate. Let's do one more, and then we can sort of catch up out in the hall for anybody who's left. Especially since the speaker sounds like it's ready to explode.
Well, I just wondered about how much you think Rush Limbaugh influenced the elections last November.
Rush says, and I think he's right, that he didn't have that much direct influence. What Limbaugh did was he captured people's basic skepticism about the way things are. In his book, The Way Things Are and the Way Things Ought to Be, that's a pretty brilliant way of staging your titles of your books. And I think Limbaugh really did, he served as everybody's steam valve. And a lot of the things he said made sense. A lot of the stuff he talked about appealed not only to common sense, but withstood scrutiny in terms of the facts. And so I think it emboldened some people who may not have been politically active to be politically active. But it's foolish to say that Limbaugh kind of brainwashed the electorate or that he changed the vote. These trends were underway well before Rush Limbaugh came to New York and became a big star. But he happened to be a guy who was sort of standing on the mountaintop shouting the loudest when it all came to bear. And furthermore, Limbaugh, what a great show. He's a great showman. And of all the people I can think of, including me, he's the only one, with the possible exception of columnist Bob Novak, who said repeatedly and with confidence, Republicans are going to win in '94. He was right. People think, woohoo, this guy is good. And he is good. But Rush says, and he's completely right about this, he's an entertainer. and he's the best. He is the best. Everybody who says, well, we're going to come up with a liberal Rush Limbaugh, you can't come up with a liberal Rush Limbaugh. You can't come up with another conservative one. He's one of a kind. He's a guy with special gifts that were honed by being a nobody for 18 years in godforsaken radio stations from coast to coast. You know, and also being, by the way, a PR director for the Kansas City Royals along the way. So, I mean, Limbaugh is a guy who earned it the hard way, and I think he has a greater connection with real Americans and the American dream because he's had to fight harder. He's had to work harder. Here he comes from the great Limbaugh family of Cape Girardeau, you know, all these judges and people's streets named after him. And here he is, this bum who's working at radio stations. The whole family is saying, what's wrong with Rush? He's Rush Limbaugh III. He's got something to live up to. God help Rush Limbaugh IV. Thanks.
I would like to thank the following organizations that helped put on Excellence in Governance Day: Ensuring Tomorrow, Concert Board, University Program Council, the Student Government Association, the Ward Edwards Library, the Student Activity Fee, the Association of Student Leaders, and the Office of the President. And most of all, I would like to thank you for attending Excellence in Governance Day. There's a reception in the Hendricks Hall lobby.
Thank you. I'll have to look on, I can't see it.